My son's teacher looked me in the eye and said the word that shattered me: hopeless. She called my boy hopeless, like his future had already been written, like he'd never amount to anything. But what she didn't know was that my son was hiding something so powerful it would one day leave her completely speechless. This is the story of how a child, branded as hopeless, proved everyone wrong when his teacher unknowingly read the book he secretly published. And to understand how we got there, I need to take you back to where it all began. From the very first day my son walked into school, I noticed something the teachers didn't. He wasn't like the other children. While the rest of the kids ran into the classroom with bright eyes and loud voices, my boy clung to my hand just a little longer. His small fingers tightened around mine, as if letting go meant stepping into a world he wasn't quite ready for. I bent down, kissed the top of his head, and whispered that he was going to do great. But even then, even on that very first morning, I saw the hesitation in his eyes. He carried himself like someone who already knew school wasn't built for him. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than nerves. First day jitters. Every child has them, right? But it wasn't. Within weeks, the notes started coming home. Little slips of paper folded neatly into his backpack, each one filled with polite but crushing words. Your son struggles to stay focused. He has trouble keeping up with reading. He doesn't follow directions. Every parent knows that sinking feeling when a teacher pulls you aside at pickup. The polite smile, the soft voice, the carefully chosen words that are meant to sound gentle but carry the weight of judgment. They don't want to crush you, but they do. The meaning is always clear. Your child isn't enough. I sat in those tiny parent-teacher conference chairs, knees pressed under tables too small for adults, nodding along as they showed me charts and graphs. Test scores compared to grade averages, numbers circled in red. I watched as teachers pointed at where he should be versus where he was. My heart raced with every page, as if each number, each red mark, was a verdict on not just him but me. Behind, that word kept echoing in my head. Behind in reading, behind in math, behind in comprehension, behind in focus. It was like a drumbeat, steady and merciless. But what no one seemed to see was what I saw at home. Because at home, he wasn't behind. At home, he was magic. He would take a pile of mismatched Lego bricks and build entire cities, each street with a name, each building with a purpose, each character with a story. He'd narrate as he played, his little voice shifting for every role: the hero, the villain, the wise old guide. His imagination painted pictures in the air that left me stunned. He wasn't just playing, he was creating. Worlds grew out of his hands, stories spilled from his lips. But the teachers didn't see any of that. They only saw the boy who struggled to read from the blackboard, the boy whose letters tilted the wrong way, whose numbers danced out of place. It wasn't just the grades. It was the way the system treated him. When he was slow to finish a worksheet, they'd quietly collect it before he was done, as if time itself was more important than understanding. When he stumbled reading aloud, the other kids would giggle, and the teacher would gently move on to someone else, someone faster, someone smarter. Do you know what that does to a child? It teaches them, little by little, that they are less. And I could see it taking root in him. I saw it in his shoulders, the way they slumped lower with every passing month. I saw it in his hand, the way it stopped shooting up in class. Because why bother if no one believed he had the right answer? I saw it in his art, how he stopped bringing home the wild drawings he was once so proud of. One evening he came home with a crumpled worksheet, his eyes shiny with unshed tears. Before I could ask what was wrong, he whispered words that pierced me like a knife. "Mom, maybe I'm just dumb." That sentence shattered something inside me. I dropped to my knees right there in the kitchen, took his small face in my hands, and looked straight into his tearful eyes. "Listen to me," I said, my voice breaking. "You are not dumb. You are not broken. You just think differently. And one day, people will see how incredible that really is." He nodded, but I could see the doubt still swimming in his gaze. And that's when the guilt hit me hardest, because no matter how much I reassured him, deep down, I was afraid. What if the teachers were right? What if I was clinging to hope just because I was his mother? Nights turned into battles. Homework ended in tears more often than smiles. I bought flashcards, phonics books, math games, anything I thought could help. But every attempt ended the same way: frustration, a slammed pencil, a child who whispered, "I can't." And slowly, something even worse happened. He began to hate the very sight of books. He'd push them away, with trembling hands, muttering, "They don't like me." Imagine that at 8 years old. He believed books themselves hated him. And people around us noticed. Relatives started making their comments, not cruel, but casual. "Well, maybe he's just not academic," one suggested with a shrug. Another told me, "Not every kid is cut out for school. He'll find something else he's good at." Every comment was like a blade twisting deeper, because I knew my son had a spark, just not the kind they measured with red pens and bubble tests. Still, every year I clung to hope. Every September was a reset button, a new classroom, a new teacher, a new chance. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe someone would finally see what I saw. But every year the cycle repeated itself. Polite smiles, sympathetic tones, the same labels over and over again. Delayed, struggling, behind. Those words stuck to him like shadows, following him from classroom to classroom, year to year, until they began to cling not just to his schoolwork, but to his identity. And as his mother, I fought like hell to convince him otherwise. But it's hard to fight the entire world when you're only one voice. Still, I held on to one promise, whispered to myself at night when the doubts came creeping. This is not the end of his story. This is just one chapter. And one day, the world will know the real boy I see every single day. But I didn't know then that the worst was yet to come. The storm was waiting in the form of a single teacher, the one who would crush him with a word so cruel, so final, it would scar us both. Every parent hopes that one year will be different. A new classroom, a new teacher, a fresh start. That's what I kept telling myself when my son entered 3rd grade. I knelt down that morning, smoothed the collar of his shirt, and told him, "This year will be better." I said it with a smile, but inside I was begging for it to be true. The first day of school always had its own energy, almost electric. The hallways buzzed with chatter as children carried backpacks stuffed with new supplies. Their sneakers squeaked against the freshly polished floors, their laughter bouncing off the lockers. Parents clustered by the doors, bending down for last-minute hugs, whispering reminders to be kind, to listen, to try their best. I held my son's hand tightly, praying he couldn't feel how clammy my palm was, hoping he could draw confidence from me I didn't actually have. And then we met her, Mrs. Klein. She was a tall woman with sharp glasses and an even sharper gaze. Her hair was pulled back into such a tight bun it looked painful. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable, and her voice carried the tone of someone who didn't have time for nonsense. When she shook my hand, it was brief, perfunctory-like, an item on a checklist. Her eyes flicked past me to my son, scanning him as though he were a report card she had already graded. No smile, no warmth, just a measuring look. She handed me a paper, crisp and typed in bold font. It was a list of classroom expectations, homework policies, and grading systems. It read less like a welcome to a year of growth and more like a legal contract. Everything was outlined in percentages, penalties, and consequences. I forced myself to smile politely. Maybe she was just firm. Maybe structure was what my son needed. Maybe. But it didn't take long for my optimism to crumble. Within weeks, I saw my son's spark dim even more. The comments on his assignments weren't encouraging. They were condemning. Sloppy work. Needs to try harder. Careless mistakes. Always written in harsh red ink, underlined twice as if the severity of the judgment needed to be emphasized. I wanted to scream every time I read them. Because I knew the truth. I had seen him at the kitchen table, his small body hunched forward, his pencil gripped so tightly his knuckles turned white. I had seen his tongue poke out in concentration, his little brow furrowed, his eraser worn down to the nub because he kept checking and rechecking his answers. That was not a boy who didn't care. That was a boy trying harder than anyone gave him credit for. But Mrs. Klein didn't see effort. She only saw results. In her classroom, speed and accuracy were currency, and my son was poor. If he stumbled while reading aloud, she would let out an exaggerated sigh and say, "Let's move on to someone else." The sigh alone was enough to make him shrink into himself, but she didn't stop there. If he raised his hand to ask a question, she would snap, "We've already gone over this. You need to pay attention." The other kids noticed. Children are sponges. They don't just absorb information, they absorb attitudes. And slowly, they started to follow her lead. They whispered when he got answers wrong. They chuckled when he struggled to read. Some even rolled their eyes when his turn came. And nothing cuts sharper than that kind of laughter, especially in a classroom. It tells a child, "You are the joke." I began to dread pickup time. I would wait in the car line, watching for him to emerge. And when he did, he always looked the same backpack, sagging off one shoulder, eyes downcast, his steps dragging as though each one cost him more than he had to give. When I asked, "How was your day?" he'd shrug and mumble, "Fine," but fine never meant fine. Fine meant he was too tired to tell me how small he had felt for 6 straight hours. Then came the day that would be etched into my memory forever. It was October, the leaves outside just beginning to turn red and gold. The air was crisp, the kind of air that usually brought a sense of renewal. But that morning my stomach was knotted with dread. I had been called in for another meeting, another evaluation, another round of sitting across, from a teacher who had already made up her mind about my child. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and chalk dust, the floor squeaking under my shoes as I walked. My son trailed beside me, silent, his small hand sweaty in mine. He didn't ask why we were there. He didn't need to. He already knew. We entered the classroom. Mrs. Klein was at her desk, her papers stacked in neat, unforgiving piles. She didn't invite me to sit. I had to pull out the chair myself. The fluorescent lights hummed above us. buzzing like an unkind reminder of how stark and cold the room felt. She folded her hands, leaned forward, and delivered the words that would scar us both. "Your son," she said in a voice so cold and final it sent a chill through me, "is hopeless, hopeless." The word hit me like a punch to the chest. My ears rang, my throat closed, and for a second I couldn't breathe. Surely I had misheard her. No teacher, no person entrusted with children would use that word. But when I asked her to repeat herself, she did. "He is hopeless. He doesn't try. He doesn't listen. He will never catch up. You need to accept that. Hopeless." She said it not like an opinion, but like a fact, like a sentence carved into stone. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout until the walls shook. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she didn't know him the way I did, that she had no right to brand him with a word so cruel. I wanted to grab my son and storm out, shielding him from her poison. But the damage was already done. I turned to him, desperate to read his reaction. He sat beside me, eyes glued to the floor, shoulders hunched, his small frame folding in on itself. And that silence, that awful, heavy silence, was worse than the word itself. Because in that silence, I saw it. He believed her. Somewhere deep inside, he had been waiting for someone to confirm his worst fear, that he really was broken, that he really couldn't measure up, that all the struggles he carried meant something was wrong with him. And she had given him that confirmation. I left the meeting shaking, fury coursing through me like fire in my veins. On the outside, I managed to keep my voice steady. I nodded stiffly, gathered our things, and walked out of the building with my son trailing beside me. But the second we got into the car, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, I thought it might snap. I had never felt rage like that before. Not just rage at her, but at the entire system that could crush a child with a single careless word. That night, my son hardly spoke. He picked at his dinner, pushing food around his plate without ever lifting his fork to his mouth. When he excused himself early, I heard the quiet click of his bedroom door shutting, and I stood frozen in the hallway with tears streaming down my face. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it, because I knew that if I did, I would see him curled up on his bed, carrying the weight of a lie that had been planted deep inside him. I had fought so hard to protect him from labels, from whispers, from the sting of failure. But with one brutal, unforgivable word, Mrs. Klein had undone years of reassurance. She had taken his fragile hope and crushed it under her heel. That night, lying in my bed, staring at the ceiling, I made myself a promise. No one, not a teacher, not a system, not even the world itself, would ever define my son with that word again. He was not hopeless. I would not let him be. But even as I made that promise, fear gnawed at me, because the way he had withdrawn into himself after that day scared me more than anything. He was retreating, and when children retreat, they build walls, and behind those walls, something was happening that I couldn't yet see. After that meeting with Mrs. Klein, my son was never quite the same. It was as if the word hopeless had sunk deep into his bones and built a home there. My lively little boy, the one who used to chatter endlessly about dragons, rockets, and adventures, began to fade right in front of me. He came home from school quieter than ever. No stories about his day, no silly jokes about his teachers, not even the usual complaints about the cafeteria food. Just silence. He'd drop his backpack at the door, mumble a half-hearted hi, and vanish into his room before I could even ask how things went. The boy who once begged me to play board games or ride bikes after dinner now wanted nothing to do with anything outside those four walls. At first, I told myself it was just a phase. Kids go through moods, right? Maybe he just needed time to recover from the sting of that awful word. Maybe after a few days, he would bounce back. But days stretched into weeks, and instead of healing, he slipped further away. Family dinners became heavy and awkward. The table, once alive with laughter and stories, now felt like a courtroom where no one dared to speak. I'd ask him gentle questions. What did you learn today? Or who did you sit with at lunch? And he'd shrug, give me a one-word answer, and stare down at his plate as though the peas and carrots were far more interesting than me. Homework became a battlefield. He used to at least try, even if it ended in the tears and frustration. But now he didn't even want to try. The sight of math worksheets made him groan, as though just looking at the numbers hurt. Reading assignments were met with a stubborn shake of his head. It's pointless, he muttered once, his voice sharp with defeat. Those words nearly broke me. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, worry gnawing at me. Was my son slipping into a place I couldn't reach? Depression is real, even in children. The thought that he might be giving up before he had even discovered who he was kept me awake until dawn, more nights than I can count. But then little signs began to appear. Signs that something was happening behind that closed bedroom door. It started with sound. Late at night, when the house was quiet, and I was folding laundry or cleaning up after everyone else had gone to bed, I'd hear it faintly through his door, the scratch, scratch, scratch of a pencil moving across paper. At first, I thought he was doodling. He used to draw a lot, though he had stopped showing me his sketches. After school started crushing him, maybe, I told myself, drawing was his comfort, his private escape. But the way he hid it made me suspicious. Whenever I'd knock and push open the door, he'd slam a notebook shut so quickly it startled me, or shove loose pages under his pillow. If I asked, "What are you working on?" he'd shake his head too fast, eyes wide, and say, "Nothing." His voice always carried a note of panic, like being discovered would ruin everything. Then came the scraps, crumpled pieces of paper stuffed into his pockets, left on the living room floor, tucked into couch cushions, even buried at the bottom of the laundry basket. One Saturday morning, I found a handful while folding clothes. His handwriting was messy, letters uneven, words misspelled. But when I smoothed them out, I realized they weren't spelling lists or math problems. They were sentences, scenes, little fragments of something bigger. A boy walking through a forest, searching for a hidden treasure. A girl who built a castle out of glass. A kingdom where everyone told the hero he would fail only for him to prove them wrong in the end. I froze, the papers trembling in my hands. These weren't doodles. They were stories, real stories. That evening, I tried to bring it up without scaring him. I sat beside him while he was on the floor, building with Lego bricks, and said softly, "Sweetheart, I found some of your papers today. The stories, they were wonderful." His eyes snapped up in alarm. His hands froze midair, clutching a red Lego block. His cheeks flushed crimson. "They're dumb," he muttered quickly, shoving the block aside. "Just stupid stuff." "No," I said gently, reaching for his hand. "They were creative. They were powerful. You made me want to know what happens next. but he didn't believe me. He yanked his hand away, shook his head, and scrambled to his feet. Without another word, he retreated to his room, the slam of the door echoing like a rejection. A moment later, I heard the sharp click of the lock. My chest ached, but my instincts told me not to push. His notebooks weren't just scribbles, they were his sanctuary, the one part of himself he still controlled, after being humiliated and dismissed everywhere else. If I barged into that safe place, I risked destroying it. So I waited, and as I waited, I observed. Night after night, the light from under his door glowed longer than it used to, sometimes past midnight. The scratching of his pencil carried on like a quiet drumbeat against the silence of the house. He would come to breakfast with tired eyes, his hair sticking up wildly, his hands smudged with pencil lead. I knew then he wasn't giving up. He was working harder than ever. Just not on the things his teachers demanded. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I waited until I was sure he was asleep, his soft breathing filling the quiet house. I tiptoed into his room, careful not to wake him, and found a notebook clutched loosely in his hand as though he had drifted off mid-sentence. Slowly, carefully, I slid it out from under his fingers and opened it. What I saw made me sit down on the edge of his bed, stunned. Page after page filled with stories. Entire chapters, written in messy but determined handwriting. Characters with names, personalities, and dreams. Whole kingdoms with rivers and forests, drawn in shaky maps that stretched across entire pages. Battles between heroes and villains, conversations that seemed to leap off the page. His spelling wasn't perfect, his grammar was patchy, but his imagination was extraordinary. Tears blurred my vision as I flipped through the notebook. My son the boy, his teacher had called hopeless was writing. Not school assignments, not worksheets, not practice sentences. Stories, worlds, lives. I closed the notebook gently, placed it back in his hand, and leaned down to kiss his forehead. "You're not hopeless," I whispered. "You're brilliant." He stirred slightly in his sleep, but didn't wake. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. All the reports, the test scores, the red-inked comments, they meant nothing, because I could see the truth now. He hadn't stopped learning. He hadn't stopped growing. He was just doing it in a way no one else bothered to notice. At first, I thought it was just doodles and daydreams. I was wrong. The night I slipped that notebook from his sleeping hand, I thought I had seen everything, but I hadn't. That single book was just the doorway. Over the following weeks, I discovered that my son had been quietly building not just a story, but an entire world. It started with little hints. I'd walk past his room and catch glimpses of pages spread across the desk maps drawn in pencil, names scrawled in the margins, entire paragraphs written and then scratched out with frustration. Sometimes I'd hear him muttering under his breath, speaking dialogue out loud, practicing the voices of his characters. He wasn't just writing for fun. He was living inside these stories. One evening, when he was at a friend's house, I couldn't help myself. I went into his room and found a stack of notebooks tucked inside, an old shoebox beneath his bed. My hands shook as I pulled them out in one by one. Each book was different, some with bent covers, some nearly falling apart, but all of them filled. I sat cross-legged on the floor and opened the first. And what I found left me breathless. The stories weren't childish. They weren't random scribbles of imagination. They had depth, structure, and heart. Some heroes started small and frightened, but grew into something powerful. Some villains sneered, doubted, and underestimated. There were side characters who mocked, only to be proven wrong. The parallels were impossible to miss. He was writing his own life, hidden under the disguise of fantasy. The hero was him. The villains were his teachers, his classmates, his fears. And every time, the boy who was doubted triumphed in the end. I flipped through page after page, tears blurring my vision. His creativity was staggering. Whole kingdoms stretched across the margins, rivers winding between mountains, castles marked with symbols, villages filled with names and details. Dialogues between characters sounded alive, so vivid I could hear them in my head. He wasn't failing at learning. He wasn't hopeless. He was flying in a world none of his teachers had even bothered to look at. But with that discovery came something else, something painful. When I gently asked him about his stories, his face hardened instantly. "They're dumb," he muttered, clutching his notebook to his chest like a shield. "Nobody would care." The shame in his voice cut me deeper than anything his teacher had said. He believed his words didn't matter, that if anyone saw his work, they'd laugh. He'd been mocked so many times in the classroom that he couldn't imagine his stories being valued anywhere else. I tried to reassure him. "Sweetheart, your writing is amazing. You're creating worlds. That's not something everyone can do." But he shook his head, his eyes fixed on the floor. "It doesn't count. It's not real. School is real." That was the tragedy. He thought the only things that mattered were the things measured in grades, tests, and red-inked corrections. And since he couldn't shine there, he believed he couldn't shine anywhere. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart aching with equal parts pride and sorrow. I had discovered something extraordinary, but he didn't believe in it himself. How could I convince him that this secret world of words was not only real, but valuable? How could I make him see that he wasn't broken, he was gifted? The truth was, I didn't know yet. I only knew one thing. I couldn't let this gift stay hidden forever. His imagination deserved more than dust-covered notebooks shoved under a bed. It deserved light. It deserved to be read. But I also knew the risk. Forcing him to share too soon could shatter the fragile confidence. That was just beginning to flicker. If the wrong person dismissed his writing, it might extinguish it altogether. So I made myself a promise. I would protect his world until he was ready. I would be the guardian of his stories, the keeper of his secret gift. And when the time came, I would help him show the world what I already knew, that he was anything but hopeless. But what could I do with this discovery? And would he ever believe in himself enough to share it? After discovering the secret worlds he had hidden in his notebooks, I felt two emotions warring inside me: awe at his imagination and sorrow at the fact that he thought it didn't matter. He didn't see himself the way I did. He saw failure, rejection, and shame. I saw brilliance raw, unpolished, untamed brilliance. It was like holding a diamond still caked in dirt. I knew it was worth it, but he only saw the mess. I knew I had to find a way to help him believe in himself again. The question was how. I started small. I couldn't risk overwhelming him. He guarded his stories like a secret treasure, and if I pressed too hard, I might drive him deeper into hiding. So I slipped encouragement into ordinary moments, disguised as casual conversation. At breakfast, while pouring milk into his cereal, I'd say things like, "You know, I kept thinking about that story you wrote yesterday. The way you described the castle, it was so clear in my head. That's talent, sweetheart. He'd roll his eyes, stir his cereal, and mutter, "It's nothing." But I noticed the way his lips twitched, almost fighting a smile, before he buried his face in the bowl. That almost smile was my first glimpse of hope. On the drive to school, it'd bring up famous writers. I knew he'd heard of some of them. Did you know that J.K. Rowling got rejected by 12 publishers before anyone gave her a chance? 12. And now her books are everywhere. Can you imagine if she had given up? He shrugged, staring out the window as the trees blurred by. That's different, he said quietly. She's her. I'm just me. That hurt to hear. Because to me, being just him was enough. More than enough. But I bit back the tears and simply said, she was just her too, once. Just a woman with a story, and no one to believe in her yet. At dinner, I told him stories about people who didn't fit the mold. I brought up Albert Einstein, who was labeled slow as a child. Walt Disney, who was told he lacked imagination. Thomas Edison, whose teacher said he was too stupid to learn. All the kids who were dismissed, underestimated, laughed at, until they changed the world. Sometimes, I told him gently, being different isn't a weakness. It's the first sign you're meant to do something extraordinary. Still, he resisted. He stabbed at his peas with a fork and said flatly, "Not me. Everyone thinks I'm dumb." That night, my voice came out sharper than I intended. "No," I said firmly, almost angrily, "not everyone. Your teacher may have said that awful word, but she doesn't get to decide who you are. You're the only one who can do that." He froze, then shrugged, pushing his food around again. He didn't argue, but the silence that followed told me he didn't believe me either. For weeks, this became our dance. I'd drop little seeds of encouragement, and he'd brush them away with doubt. I tried not to push too hard, but inside I was desperate. Desperate because I knew what he had inside him could change everything. Not just for him, but for anyone who read his words. And I couldn't bear the thought of those stories staying locked in notebooks forever, gathering dust while he carried around the lie that he was worthless. One evening, I tried a new tactic. He was sprawled across the living room floor with his Legos, half building, half daydreaming. I sat beside him and said, "Sweetheart, you know sometimes when people make fun of others, it's not because those people are dumb. It's because they're scared of what they don't understand." He didn't look up. He pressed 2 Lego bricks together and muttered, "They're not scared of me. They just think I'm dumb." His voice was so soft I barely heard it. I swallowed hard, fighting the ache in my chest. He was building walls around himself faster than I could tear them down. And then, one night as I tucked him into bed, I decided to try a different angle altogether. Instead of telling him what I thought, I asked him a question. "Sweetheart," I said softly, smoothing the blanket over his chest, "what would you do if nobody could laugh at you? If nobody could even know it was you?" His eyes flicked up at me, confusion and curiosity mixing in his expression. "What do you mean?" I said carefully. "What if we shared your stories, but we didn't use your name? Nobody at school would know. Nobody could tease you. It would be completely anonymous. Just your words out there in the world. And then we let the world decide what they think." His eyes widened slightly. He pulled the blanket up to his chin, suspicion clouding his face. "But what if nobody reads it?" I smiled, softly, brushing his hair off his forehead. "Then nobody reads it. And your stories are still safe. But what if one person does? What if one kid out there, maybe a kid, who feels the same way you do reads your words and realizes they're not alone? What if someone loves it? Wouldn't that be worth trying? He frowned, chewing his lip the way he always did when he was thinking hard. I could almost see the battle raging inside him. On one side, years of humiliation, teachers shaking their heads, classmates giggling, relatives whispering. On the other hand, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, his stories mattered. The silence stretched so long I thought he was going to refuse. My heart sank. But then, in the faintest whisper, he said, "If we do it, nobody at school can ever know. Ever." "Of course," I said instantly, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "It'll be our secret." He hesitated for another long moment, then gave the smallest nod. "Okay." And just like that, a seed of confidence had been planted. Small, fragile, but alive. It was the beginning of something new. He hesitated, then agreed on one condition. No one at school could ever know. Once he finally agreed, the real work began. I had promised him that no one at school would ever know, and I meant it. This wasn't just about publishing a book, it was about protecting the fragile little seed of confidence that had finally sprouted inside him. This was going to be our secret project, something built late at night when the rest of the world was asleep. Just him, me, and the words he had carried alone for so long. We started by pulling his notebooks out from under the bed. There were more than I realized. He stacked them nervously on the table, the pile leaning dangerously as if it might topple. Each one was worn and dog-eared, their pages bulging from being stuffed with scraps and loose sheets. He touched the top notebook with trembling fingers and whispered, "I don't know if any of it makes sense." I smiled gently and pulled the first notebook toward me. "It makes more sense than you think. Let's take it one page at a time." Typing his words became our nightly ritual. We'd sit side by side at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between keystrokes. Sometimes I typed while he dictated, his voice soft and unsure as he read from his messy handwriting. Other times he would peer over my shoulder, wincing at every typo as if I were breaking the story by misplacing a single letter. The sound of keys clicking filled our home long after everyone else had gone to bed. It wasn't easy. Some nights ended in frustration. He'd slam the notebook shut and mutter, "Forget it. This is stupid. Nobody's going to read this anyway." I'd close the laptop carefully, turn to him and say, "It matters because it's yours." That's reason enough to finish. Slowly, his shoulders would relax, and we'd open the notebook again. Editing was another challenge. His stories were raw, messy, and full of brilliance, hidden beneath spelling errors and crooked sentences. Sometimes he'd tell me to cut a paragraph because it doesn't sound good. I'd read it aloud, giving life to his words, and watch as his eyes widened. Hearing it spoken back to him made it real. It made him realize his words carried weight. More than once he whispered, "That actually sounds good," and the corner of his mouth lifted into the smallest smile. But doubt was never far away. One night, after we had typed 10 straight pages, he pushed the chair back suddenly. His eyes were wet, his fists clenched. What if they laugh? What if people online think it's dumb? What if they say the same things Mrs. Klein said? I took his hands, pried them open gently, and held them. "Sweetheart, listen to me. If one person out there laughs, that's their problem. But if one person out there feels seen because of your words, then it's worth it. You're not writing for the people who mock you. You're writing for the ones who need your stories, just like you needed them." He didn't answer, but the tears in his eyes told me he understood. Little by little, the manuscript came together. Weeks passed, pages piled up. I watched as the stories that had lived in secret for so long transformed into a single document on my laptop, neat and organized. For the first time, his world wasn't just hidden in notebooks under the bed. It was alive on a screen, ready to meet the world. Then came the moment of choosing a name. He refused to use his real one, terrified that somehow it would circle back to school. We spent an entire evening brainstorming pen names, scribbling ideas on scraps of paper. Some were silly, some were serious, some he rejected instantly. Finally, he landed on one he liked: short, mysterious, safe. When he wrote it down and saw it on the cover page, I saw something flicker in his expression: pride, ownership. For the first time, he wasn't just a boy scribbling in notebooks. He was an author. Formatting the book became another adventure. We added chapter titles, page breaks, a simple cover we designed together using free tools online. He insisted on picking the cover art, scrolling through images until he found one that matched the world he had built in his head. When he saw the mock-up of his story with an actual book cover, he stared at it in stunned silence. "It looks real," he whispered, "like an actual book." "It is an actual book," I told him. "Yours." The night we uploaded the file, I don't think either of us breathed normally. My laptop sat open on the kitchen table, the glowing screen showing the final step: publish. His hands trembled as he hovered over the trackpad. "I can't do it," he whispered. "You do it." I shook my head. "No, sweetheart. This is your story. You've carried it this far. You have to be the one to press the button." His breathing quickened, shallow and uneven. His finger hovered over the mouse for what felt like an eternity. I placed my hand gently over his. "You're not alone. I'm right here." And then, with one small click, it was done. The screen refreshed, and in an instant, his book was live, out there, real. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stared at the screen in silence, as if we couldn't quite believe what we had done. Then he let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half terror. "It's out there," he whispered. "People can actually read it." "Yes," I said, pulling him into a hug. "They can, and they will." He clung to me, his small body trembling, his heartbeat racing against mine. And in that moment, I knew something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just the boy teachers labeled. He wasn't just the child hiding in his room. He was a writer, a creator, someone brave enough to put a piece of himself into the world. Neither of us expected what would happen next. The first night after publishing, he barely slept. I could hear him shifting under the covers, tossing and turning, his mind racing with what-ifs. Every creak of the bed frame, every sigh, told me he was replaying all the cruel words he had ever heard. By morning, he looked exhausted. At breakfast, he pushed his cereal around with his spoon and whispered, "Nobody's going to read it. I bet not a single person will." His voice cracked on that last word. I wanted to reassure him, but the truth was I didn't know either. All I could say was, "Give it time. The world is bigger than you think." For days, nothing happened. No reviews, no sales, no feedback of any kind. Each evening, he would hover nervously by my shoulder as I refreshed the page, his eyes searching for any change. Each morning, his face fell when the screen showed the same blank space. the silence of the internet can feel louder than any insult. And I could see it eating away at him. His shoulders slumped lower each day, and I feared he would retreat back into himself. But then one afternoon, a miracle happened. A tiny notification appeared at the top of the books page. One review posted. His eyes went wide, his breath catching in his throat. "Someone read it?" he whispered, hardly daring to believe. My own hands trembled as I clicked the link, and together we leaned in to read. The review was short, only 3 sentences, but it carried more power than any lecture, any test, any teacher's opinion. This story is full of heart. The imagination is incredible. I can't believe this came from a new writer. Can't wait to read more. My son sat frozen, staring at the words. His lips parted slightly, and for a long moment he didn't speak. Then slowly a smile crept across his face. Not a quick grin, not a forced one, but the real kind. The kind I hadn't seen in months. More reviews followed. At first, just 1 or 2 more, then 5, then 10. Each one carried the same theme: praise for his creativity, his characters, his ability to build worlds so vivid they felt alive. One person wrote, "This feels like reading the early works of a young Tolkien." Another said, "The descriptions are so beautiful, I could picture every scene." And yet another begged, "Please tell me there's going to be a sequel." Each review was like water to a plant that had been left to wither. I watched him drink in every word, his eyes flicking over the sentences again and again, as though he was afraid they might disappear. I could almost see him standing taller, a little straighter, as if each line, stitched back together, a piece of the confidence that had been torn away. Still, doubt lingered. "What if they're just being nice?" he asked one evening, scrolling through the comments. "What if they're saying it because they feel sorry for me?" I shook my head firmly. Strangers don't waste their time lying. These people don't know you. If they're writing this, it's because your words truly meant something to them. He didn't argue, but he bit his lip, as though afraid to let himself believe too much. Then came the emails. Readers found the anonymous author through the contact link we had set up on the books page. One by one, messages began arriving. Some were short, just a thank you. Others were long, pouring out personal stories of how his book had touched them. I remember one email in particular. A woman wrote, "I was going through a tough time. Your book made me feel less alone. Thank you for writing it." When he read those words, his hands shook so badly, he had to set the laptop down. They felt what I felt," he whispered, his voice breaking. The sales numbers started to climb slowly. First a handful, then dozens, then hundreds. Not enough to make him famous, not enough to appear on any charts, but enough to prove that people out there were paying money to read his words. Each sale felt like a tiny victory against the voice that had once labeled him hopeless. But it wasn't just numbers. Something more beautiful happened. An online community began to form around his book. On social media, strangers posted quotes from his story, drawing fan art of his characters, writing their own theories about what might happen next. One reader even tagged the anonymous author in a post that said, "This book saved me this week. I don't know who you are, but thank you." He stared at the post for a long time, speechless. Finally, he whispered, "They don't even know me, and they still care." Day by day, I watched him change. He began to carry himself differently, as if the invisible weight he had been dragging around was finally lifting. He smiled more. He laughed sometimes. He no longer shoved his notebooks under the bed in shame. Instead, he placed them proudly on his desk, stacked neatly, ready to be opened at any time. His room, once silent and heavy, was filled again with the scratching sound of his pen racing across paper. One evening, I peeked in and found him hunched over his desk, scribbling furiously. "Homework?" I asked, half teasing. He shook his head, grinning. "No." "Book 2." I almost cried right there in the doorway. For the first time in a long time, my son believed in himself. He wasn't broken. He wasn't hopeless. He was a storyteller, and the world had confirmed it. But fate wasn't finished. The biggest test of all was still waiting inside the very classroom where he had been branded hopeless. It had been months since the world first discovered my son's book. At home, he had grown in confidence. He smiled more, laughed sometimes, and even began planning his sequel. But school was still his battlefield, the place that had first branded him with that cruel word, hopeless. No matter how many glowing reviews he read at night, no matter how many strangers sent messages praising his imagination, the fear of being exposed at school still haunted him. Then one Monday afternoon, he walked through the front door with his backpack slung low, his face pale and heavy. He didn't even say hello, just dropped his bag onto the floor and muttered, "Mom, we have to do book reports." I tried to smile. "Book reports aren't so bad, sweetheart." But he shook his head, his eyes full of panic. He explained that his English teacher, the very one who had once dismissed him so cruelly, had announced a new assignment. Each student had to choose a book, read it thoroughly, and then present a report to the class. "She said it has to be real literature," he added, his voice breaking on the words. "She said she doesn't want anyone wasting time on those silly, self-published things." My stomach twisted. She had no idea what she was saying, of course. She didn't know that the very type of work she mocked was the lifeline that had saved him, the reason he was smiling again, the proof he wasn't broken. Her words cut like a blade, and I could see in his trembling hands that they had sliced deep into him. The next day, he came home with the news that made my heart stop. Out of all the titles in the world, one of his classmates, completely by chance, had chosen his book, his anonymous book. He stared at me, eyes wide with fear, whispering, "Mom, what if she finds out? What if everyone laughs at me?" I pulled him into my arms and said the only thing I could. Or what if she finally sees the truth? The following week, the reports began. One by one, students stood at the front of the classroom, nervously presenting their chosen books. My son sat at his desk, his body stiff, his fingers curled tight around his pencil. The room buzzed with the usual chatter and half-bored attention spans. Most kids were just trying to get through it, hoping not to embarrass themselves. But then the classmates stood up. They held up the book, his book, and announced the title. My son froze. His breath caught in his throat. Those words, his words, were about to be spoken aloud in the very room where he had once been humiliated. At first, the teacher's expression was indifferent, even a little smug. She probably expected another clumsy, forgettable presentation. But as the student spoke, describing the plot, the characters, the intricate themes woven into the story, something in her face shifted. The casual look faded, replaced by faint surprise. When the student read a passage aloud, the classroom changed. The usual whispers died down. Pencils stopped tapping. Even the kids who never cared about literature leaned in to listen. My son's words filled the room, echoing off the walls that had once trapped him in shame, or words he had written in secret, under covers, by lamplight, believing no one would ever care. And now, those same words held a classroom captive. The teacher leaned forward in her chair, her pen hovering above her notebook as if she were taking mental notes. Her eyes narrowed not in cruelty, but in concentration. The lines around her mouth tightened, and I imagine, just for a moment, she was wrestling with something she couldn't quite name. Respect, curiosity, maybe even regret. The student finished their report, holding the book a little higher now, their voice stronger. "I really liked it," they said, almost proudly. "It didn't feel fake, it felt real." The author knew what it was like to feel alone, but also what it was like to fight back. A heavy silence followed, the kind that doesn't come often in a classroom full of restless kids. No laughter, no teasing, just stillness, thick and electric, as the weight of the story settled over them all. Even the teacher didn't move. She cleared her throat, finally, and asked, "Where did you find this book?" The student shrugged. "Online. It wasn't from a big publisher, but I liked it." Something flickered in the teacher's eyes, surprise, maybe even a hint of admiration, but she didn't say anything more. She just nodded, slowly, as if she were seeing something she hadn't expected. And at his desk, my son sat frozen, his heart pounding so loudly he swore everyone could hear it. His mind screamed 1,000 thoughts at once: fear, pride, terror, hope. The teacher who once called him hopeless had just sat silently, listening to his story. The classmates who once saw him as invisible had been riveted by his words. And in that silence, something extraordinary was about to happen. When the classmates sat down, the room still buzzed with the energy of the story. My son's heart pounded so hard it shook through his whole body. His hands trembled against the desk, damp with sweat, and his throat felt tight, like every breath scraped against his chest. He wanted to shrink down, to fold himself into invisibility, to let the moment pass without anyone noticing him. But fate doesn't always allow us to hide. The teacher adjusted her glasses, clearing her throat. She shifted in her chair, a flicker of surprise still lingering in her eyes. "That was very well done," she said, her voice unusually measured. "An excellent choice of book." She tried to sound composed, but there was something she couldn't quite mask, something my son heard, even if she didn't mean for it to slip through. Respect. My son stared at his desk, chewing the end of his pencil. Inside him, two storms collided. One was fear, sharp and biting, warning him to keep quiet, to never expose himself. The other was pride, fierce and rising, reminding him that those were his words being praised, his imagination being admired. And between those storms sat a choice: stay silent forever, or speak. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, and then, almost without realizing what he was doing, he raised his hand. His voice came out soft, shaky, almost fragile. That book, the entire class turned to look at him. Dozens of eyes all at once. His heart jumped into his throat. His cheeks burned hot, but he didn't lower his hand. He forced himself to go on. "That book was mine," he said, louder this time. "I wrote it." The room froze. Not a sound. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the kids who normally laughed at everything sat wide-eyed and silent. The teacher blinked, her mouth parting slightly, as if she hadn't heard him right. "What did you just say?" He swallowed, finding his voice again, Stronger this time, steadier. I wrote that book. It's mine. Gasps rippled through the classroom. A couple of students whispered urgently to each other, but no one laughed. They just stared, stunned, trying to connect the quiet boy at the back of the room with the story that had held them captive minutes ago. The realization was almost too much for them to process. The classmate who had presented turned in their seat, their eyes wide. "Wait, you mean you're the author? That's why there was no picture online?" My son nodded, his face red, but his voice calm. "Yeah, that's why." A murmur spread through the room, but this time it wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was awe. Whispers like, "No way, and that's actually amazing," floated through the air. A few kids even smiled at him, as though seeing him for the first time. The teacher's face drained of color. For a moment, she looked as if someone had ripped the ground out from beneath her. Her eyes darted from the book in the student's hand back to my son, her expression flickering between disbelief and something else, something she couldn't hide, no matter how hard she tried. Shame. "This is impossible," she muttered, shaking her head. You couldn't have written this." But my son didn't back down. He lifted his chin, his voice clear and unwavering now. "I did." Her lips parted, but no words came. She searched his face, searching for cracks in his claim, but there were none. The boy she had once dismissed as hopeless was staring back at her with a quiet defiance, holding the truth in his hands. For the first time, the balance shifted. The teacher, who had carried authority and judgment for so long, was the one left speechless. And the boy who had once cowered under her words now stood taller, his voice stronger than ever. The classmates leaned closer, curiosity in their eyes. Not ridicule, not pity, curiosity, interest. A few nodded, whispering, "That's so cool, and I can't believe it's him." He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't the boy who always got things wrong. He was the author whose story had moved them. The teacher's silence was louder than any apology. For so long she had labeled him as broken, as a failure, as someone unworthy of her time. And now she was forced to confront the undeniable truth. She had been wrong. My son didn't need her to say it. He didn't need her approval. Because in that moment, in that classroom, he realized something more important than her opinion. He realized that his words had power, his imagination had value, and his voice deserved to be heard. The true victory wasn't humiliating her, it was the way his heart finally lifted, no longer weighed down by shame. He wasn't hopeless. He was a writer, a creator, and the world, even his classroom world, finally saw it. But this was only the beginning, because what came next wasn't just about proving her wrong. It was about what he chose to do with the belief he had finally found. After that day in the classroom, my son was never the same. It was as though something inside him had finally broken free. For years he had walked with his head down, trying to make himself small so the world wouldn't notice him. But now he walked taller. He didn't slouch or hide his eyes. He looked ahead, not in arrogance, but with a quiet confidence that came from knowing the truth. The boy who once flinched at every assignment no longer dreaded school in the same way. He still struggled sometimes, numbers on math worksheets still tripped him up, and grammar drills didn't suddenly become easy overnight. But now those struggles don't define him. He no longer saw himself as a failure. He knew that a grade on a paper could never measure the size of his imagination. At home, the difference was undeniable. His notebooks were no longer shoved under his bed like secrets too shameful to share. Instead, they were stacked proudly on his desk, worn edges and all, ready to be filled with new adventures. He didn't write only at night anymore, hiding from the world. He wrote openly, sometimes at the kitchen table while I cooked, sometimes sprawled across the living room floor, his pen flying faster than his thoughts. And the stories kept coming. It was as though a dam had broken, and all the worlds he had been holding inside were rushing out at once. Heroes and villains, kingdoms and battles, friendships and betrayals, all spilling onto the page in a torrent of creativity. He didn't hesitate anymore. He didn't crumple up pages and throw them away like he used to. Now, even when he stumbled, he pressed on. Because he knew the world was listening. The reviews kept arriving too. Strangers from across the globe reached out to say his words mattered to them. Some shared how his book helped them through loneliness. Others admitted they saw themselves in his characters. I would watch his face as he read those messages, eyes wide, lips trembling, sometimes even tears slipping down his cheeks. It was the kind of validation no teacher's stamp of approval could ever give. And yet, it wasn't just about the reviews or the sales or the attention. His transformation went deeper. He began talking more, not just to me, but to others. At dinner, he would share ideas for his stories without me having to beg him to open up. At school, he found a couple of classmates who actually admired what he had done. They weren't just tolerating him anymore. They wanted to sit with him, to hear his ideas, to be part of his world. I'll never forget the day he came home and said, almost casually, "Someone asked me to help them with their creative writing project today." His voice was light, but his eyes sparkled. He wasn't just the boy who had been mocked. He was becoming a source of inspiration. One night, long after I thought he was asleep, I peeked into his room. He was at his desk, the lamp casting a warm glow over his papers. He wasn't scribbling frantically like before, hiding his work. This time he was sitting tall, writing carefully, a small smile on his lips. I leaned against the doorframe and just watched. It struck me then. He wasn't writing to escape anymore. He was writing to create, to share, to live. And then came the night he turned to me, his voice soft but steady. "Mom," he asked, "do you think I could really be a writer? Like not just as a kid, but for real, for the rest of my life." The tears came before I could stop them. I cupped his face in my hands and whispered, "Sweetheart, you already are. You've always been a writer. You just needed to believe it." In that moment, I thought back to everything. The endless meetings where teachers shook their heads, the test scores that seemed to crush him, the relatives who sighed and whispered behind closed doors, worrying about his future. And of course, that one terrible day when his teacher used the word that nearly broke him hopeless. I remembered how small he looked then, how defeated, and now here he was, the same boy, but transformed. He had taken that word and burned it down with the fire of his own imagination. That's when I realized something powerful. This journey was never really about proving his teacher wrong. It wasn't about revenge or even about validation from strangers online. It was about him proving himself right, about discovering that his voice mattered, that his words had weight, and that he was never hopeless to begin with. He had hope in every story he wrote, hope in every character he created, hope that someone, somewhere, would understand. And when the world finally heard him, that hope became real. Hopeless? No. My son had hope enough to fill 1,000 pages and the courage to share them with the world.